easier said than done, but we need to rework the FDA from the ground up, or just take your mental health out of the FDA and have a psychologically based regulatory system. Because I mean, on the medication side, they're medications, and so there's value in the government keeping the snake oil out of the system and making sure people aren't overdosed and all of that. But yeah, how are we going to go forward? It's a challenge.
Yeah, I would like to see us rework the diagnostic system and make it far more ideographic and process oriented.
Okay, everybody, welcome to the show. I'm joined here by Dr. Matthew Johnson and Professor Stephen Hayes. We're going to be discussing psychedelics and psychological flexibility today. And it's really interesting because Matt and Steve both come from a behaviorist background, and they've arrived at what I would describe as maybe a similar understanding of the core underlying processes that lead to psychological flourishing. And whenever these processes go wrong, they also lead to a lot of suffering. So although you guys might use very different language to describe these processes and these mechanisms, why do you think, first of all, that it's important to understand these mechanisms? And is it a coincidence that you both come from a behaviorist background? And let's start with Matt here.
Sure. Well, I guess in terms of the language, I think in terms of the concepts, the constructs that we use, I think it's kind of important to. I view these all as different tools, and every tool has its advantages and disadvantages, or different lenses through which to see the world. And there's no perfect lens. I mean, ultimately, the model is never the same as ground truth. So it's all a matter about the usefulness of a lens or a tool in a particular situation. And so I think the psychedelic area for me has really been this enigma. It sort of it really calls for these explanations, I think, from a variety of perspectives. What we're seeing so far in the field is that sometimes, surprisingly often, people can show large changes in their life, and not always, but in treating a number of disorders. And how do you explain that? Especially because this doesn't operate like typical psychiatric medications where you're reducing symptoms. So if it works, you keep taking it every day for, semi-permanently or permanently, and keep knocking those symptoms down. So this is very different, where people receive 1, 2, or 3 sessions, and then oftentimes we're seeing changes months or sometimes years later. And so how do you explain that? And so there are many perspectives. I mean, many perspectives will use stuff that may tend to edge or be completely in the kind of what you might call the woo language territory, just supernatural explanations, or just very loose, sort of, I don't know, perhaps from what you could call a humanistic psychology, or even a little further out, transpersonal psychology perspective. You could talk about the priorities in life, from perhaps a humanistic perspective, or the core values in people coming to the fore, things like this. But I find myself often using that behavioral lens as sort of what I view as kind of a primary lens. It's not the only lens, but everything I see is consistent with that. It's not that it's operating this way or that way. Everything has to be, or can be, potentially behaviorally understood. And sometimes the other levels of analysis are kind of easier to describe a concept. But I think of these, if someone has changed their behavior in a big way, that's because of an experience. That's by definition learning, from my perspective. So I think we know almost nothing in the field. The field is basically focused on demonstrating, finding, testing some of these changes, and we still haven't gotten to the meat of how this therapy works. So that's my answer to your question. What draws my interest.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, I think in a way there's definitely a parallel in terms of how we think. That you think of language as a tool when you sort of reflect on your own behavior, and that's part of the behavioral tradition, is to think of your own act of knowing as a scientist as itself behavior. And so you apply the same principles that you apply to others to yourself. And the context determines which ways of speaking are most useful, depending on and your goals. What are you trying to accomplish? In a way, it just as the psychedelic experience sort of stretches our ability to describe what's going on and pulls for leaping ahead rather than a kind of a bottom-up progressive, kind of allowing your terms to become grounded and expand in their scope. People leap forward and they do the best they can, but then it's really hard to create a progressive science that way. I mean, it's a way of speaking that people would be able to connect to quite easily, frankly, without a lot of scientific training, or in some areas where you jump levels of analysis and you simply talk about the underlying neurobiology, period, end of story, and then you really don't have a way of connecting with experiences of people. My own work is in clinical psychology, and especially it's driven by more transformational events. I've talked about some of my own experiences in YouTube, TEDx talks, and so forth. And we need a way of speaking that does that. The 40-year journey I've been on trying to figure out, well, what is language and cognition and perspective taking and sense of self and chosen values and all that? How can you understand those? You can't just stay, in my opinion, with principles that are drawn from non-human animals, period, end of story. And we've tried to find a way to do that. And I think with some reasonable success, just based on the breadth of application of things like acceptance and commitment therapy or training act in either case. And so the psychedelic issue is a kind of an interesting preparation where those bottom-up concepts to try to go from the most basic learning phenomena all the way up to a sense of self, consciousness, especially the hard problem of consciousness, being able to what I think Matt calls phenomenal consciousness, is a challenge for psychology, but it's a worthy one. I mean, we really want high precision, high scope, tight principles that are linked to experimentation and are not just loose metaphors and so forth, to be able to walk all the way up into the highest levels of human experience. And the challenge, the transformational kind of nature of some of the psychedelic assisted therapy, or just psychedelics, period, end of story, but sometimes not in good ways. I'm a child of the 60s and 70s. I saw the train wreck version of that. Maybe we'll get into that. Is one that if you can overcome that, if you can deal with that in a sophisticated way, you're really showing that you've got an avenue into human experience that's worth exploring. So it's kind of a natural preparation for, okay, explain this, dude. That's kind of a cool one, and it's one that interests me most about the modern version of what we're doing in psychedelics. The first version was also interesting, but didn't wear well in terms of how it was handled, including by psychologists who drove. I mean, Tim Leary was a psychologist, and so were most of the people who were, Baba Ramdas, the whole crew. So let's do it a little differently, and this time with a way that allows it to open up new territories that apply not just to psychedelic experience, but to human experience more generally.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry, Matt, go ahead.
I was going to say that that really rings true to me. This idea that the psychedelic area is one that sort of it's an interesting challenge, because how can you try to explain this thing and stay grounded? And I do see examples where I call it falling into playing the guru role, or starting to use language loosely. Like, so you mentioned phenomenal consciousness. I think my behavioral roots are a value in the sense I got a good or decent training in philosophy of science, in the sense that, like, be careful with the words you use. What do they mean? What is a construct, and how do you know this is um, uh, uh, beware of the jingle jangle phenomenon, where the same word can mean different things, or vice versa. And so, consciousness, we use one word for things that are really quite different. So you mentioned the hard problem, which is about, you could call it phenomenal consciousness. Basically, this question is like, can you explain, how do you want to explain how or why there is any subjective experience at all, which is a different question than the self-concept. I always think you could train program a computer or a robot to act in a self-referential way. That has nothing to do with whether there's an experience of any type there. There may or may not be. And that's, unfortunately, so, at the time, it seemed to still a philosophical question, the hard problem. I remained very open that one day we could get some sort of hold on addressing that question. But yeah, it's an area that's challenging, because I think the psychedelic area, because we could, all of these challenges, such as using hand wavy terms to describe and think we've come upon an explanation, where it's really just a description, and sometimes not even a good description. And we can kind of lose our grounding. And then there's also challenges I find with just the idea of phenomenology, the idea that, well, we can describe people's experiences, and we can even have our own personal beliefs about our best guesses as a person about some of these philosophical questions that unfortunately we just don't have any empirical evidence for. But that's different than ground truth. So if people believe, for example, that they have an experience of a deity, or if they believe they have an insight into you see a lot, the origins of the universe, the nature of reality, the Big Bang, other dimensions. It is science to describe what experiences under particular conditions with X dose of X compound, what people are saying, and to categorize that and what have you. That's completely divorced from whether there's any truth to what they're saying in terms of a description of reality, base reality. So it's an interesting area, because I find that it requires there's this impulse to always lift you off your feet, to unroot you scientifically. And it's going to take a lot of folks with some, decent scientific grounding to keep this field focused and moving forward.
And if I can just add to that a little bit, in a way, it's been the challenge of psychology, behavioral science, period, end of story, because there's all these different models. But if you're gonna, get the kind of scope to your concepts, you're gonna have to start with the basics. And the ones that do that tend to focus on things like the evolutionary history of the organism, just biologically, but not just that, in terms of culture and behavior and so forth. And to be able to, walk that thing up. So you really want to be able to have principles and processes and methods of look at them that start with very simple is a little dangerous, but non-human organisms, how do they behave? Walk up into more and more complexity. And in the history of psychology, there's some folks who got kind of impatient with that. I mean, I was a Maslow fan before I was a Skinner fan, as a high school student. What drew me into psychology, peak experiences and things of that kind. And he was a wonderful psychologist, but he was also convinced that you couldn't do what I just said, that you had to have a very different model of science in order to be able to deal with human experience at the level that he wanted to deal with it. And that was not uncommon. I think the humanistic folks more generally made that choice, but it meant now there's a discontinuity. And it would be very much just like you're trying to explain why is our brain the way it is. If you said, oh, it's completely different from the hominins, and we're not going to walk it out evolutionarily. Well, then there's a gap. What are you going to say then? And then magic happened. You can kind of do that clinically and psychologically and still get some things done. You can have wonderful humanistic ways of reaching people. One of the things, though, that is cool about where we are right now, I think, is that when people hear behavioral psychology, and some are probably already about to tune out, oh my God, we're going to hear that we're robots, we're rats, and this kind of ideas that it's mechanistic and it really invalidates. And you say, well, that's just this and that's just that. And you throw away complex questions and don't take them seriously. And some of that's on the behavioral tradition, frankly. There are voices that sound like that. Hopefully not the voices that are in this session. But if you can pull it off, if you can walk it out, well, then now you've done something that's really cool. And if I could say, just as a way of reconnecting with these two parallel things, the very first article that I wrote after as I call it, my night on the carpet, when I had this really important experience in my life, just dealing with my own panic disorder, was an article called Making Sense of Spirituality. And it was published in the journal Behaviorism. And it walked through, because here's this concept of mind, body, spiritual versus natural. I mean, how can you get farther away from a natural science approach than to be talking about spirituality? And yet, almost everybody has spiritual experiences if you word the questions properly. And by the way, they're quite close in some interesting ways to psychedelic experiences. And you as a scientist have to, in my opinion, have to deal with that. You can't just say, oh, that's woo-woo. No, it's human behavior. It's human experience. You have to walk it out. And in that article, I was trying to, it lays out the beginnings of what I end up trying to do with the theory of cognition and with, its clinical extension. And the point is that it was sort of meta point, is that when you take experiences seriously, all the way up at things like spirituality, but you approach them in a way that allows them to have special properties, and you don't just dismiss them or reduce them or minimize them. You take them seriously on their own terms. That's a kind of a crucible that it puts this basic language through of how can you walk up these terms that are applied in simpler circumstances to deal with something even that complex. And if you fail the test, well, then push the reset button and work on your basic concepts more. And so here we got a new test, and it's really similar, I think, in many ways, of, okay, we're going to look at psychedelic experience seriously, in part because the data that and it said it back in the 60s and 70s, but it got overwhelmed with people being afraid of all the legal restrictions and so forth. And so really important leads weren't followed. What do you have to say even about that? And I think we can say a lot about that without minimizing and without reducing, but simply by taking it seriously, but using concepts that have proven their utility in basic behavioral preparations and then expanding what's needed to sort of climb up to that level of complexity. So I'm interested in seeing where we go with this conversation.
And what you just described, Stephen, really reminds me of something that I often find myself thinking about in science, is that there are different levels of analysis. So and there are what appear to be emergent properties. So the science of chemistry and the science of physics. all of chemistry is completely based on physics. But if you were to use just the laws of physics to explain, you would be unable to. And it's sort of perhaps an open question whether even the most intelligent system would be able to explain all of those properties at the level of, I mean, maybe it's possible at the level of physics, and then you can go up to another level of biology. And so by analogy, the computer, you think, you're dealing with the graphical user interface and the icons, but underlying that is some language it's programmed that. Underlying that is, the machine language, which is ones and zeros, but it's not even ones and zeros. It's open and closed circuits. And so now, programming a simple thing that I could program using ones and zeros, billions, I don't know, like, like you just can't do it. And there are relationships, properties that become apparent once you kind of build on those complex systems, and so you simply can't, the lower level analysis isn't the tool that you can use to get a whole lot done at that higher level. But everything at that higher level is not discrete. It's not this great separation. It has to completely be built on that lower level. Just, and the point you make about evolutionary history, it makes that so well, because obviously whatever we have that's unique to humans and what that mammals have that, the other, others, or that primates have that other mammals don't have, and then, going on further, has to have been built on those common ancestors and simpler, relatively speaking, simpler systems. And so it just doesn't come out of nowhere. So, building those bridges across those levels of analysis or a whole lot of interesting action is that.
Okay, awesome. So I'm aware that some of the early research done with psychedelic therapy is done. They found that acceptance and commitment therapy is particularly effective used in conjunction with it. So, Steve, could you maybe give us just the big picture overview of what psychological flexibility is, and then maybe we can discuss what is it about psychedelics that might be helping to facilitate this in people?
Yeah, and I think I'd like to do it in a way that even goes beyond the act work, because we've been looking recently at what are the processes of change in mental health, behavioral health, and psychological flexibility is at the core of the entire world's literature on how change happens. So if you just expand the language a little bit, so use a slightly expanded language that doesn't sound too acty, and that way you don't have to feel as though I'm kind of trying to cling and say, hey, all this cool stuff is me and mine and all that kind of stuff. Let's just look at the broader picture. Learning how to be more emotionally open and flexible. All these terms require definition and clarity, but we'll start with words like emotion, cognition, etc., and we can unpack those. But learning how to be more emotionally open and flexible, more cognitively flexible and less sort of entangled with particular verbal rules and so forth, being able to sort of notice those, and then to come into a present moment, which is where we are all the time, but to allocate attention in a flexible, fluid, and voluntary way. And to do it from a sense of self as itself not entangled with those things I just said. And there it's a little harder, but I would just say from a more witnessing, noticing, observing, perspective taking sense of self. And based on that ground, which I think are a pretty good definition of what mindfulness is about, if you wanted to use that term, being able to focus on the qualities of being and doing that you want to put in your behavior. What are your values? And put goals harnessed to that as secondary, but then arrange for the creation of behavioral habits that move you in the direction of those qualities of being and doing. If you want to simplify it, learning how to be more open, be more aware, be more actively engaged in a values-based life. If you want to simplify it further, learning how to be more psychologically flexible. And then you have to remember that this also, we're social primates, needs to be extended to your social relationships and communities, and you have a body that has to be taken care of. So you need to be focused also on your bodily well-being. What I just said explains 98% of the known mediators of psychological interventions. We haven't done it yet with medications, but where we looked at the entire world's literature of all psychological interventions ever tested in a randomized trial done properly with a proper mediational analysis that's been replicated at least once by the measures that are used. What I just said, 98% or really virtually 100%, you're down to fractional things, can be explained by that. So I think our challenges in life and in culture and so forth is extending it, is learning how to be more open, aware, actively engaged, socially extending and taking care of our body, using those processes, how to do that in a way, that over time facilitates a life worth living. And psychedelics taps into that in some really interesting ways. If you look at the mediators of psychedelic assisted therapy, there's things like oceanic awareness or things like that, but there's also change in values. There's a change in perspective. There's things in there that can be understood as this greater emotional and cognitive openness, flexibility of being in the now from a different sense of self that is less bound up by judgment and ego and stories told and narratives and all that, and is more grounded in simple awareness and being able to use that to create a life that's meaningful for you and for those that you love. So I think we're on a journey as to how to do that, but we can take the science of psychological intervention and the mediators of it and bring it right up into the psychedelic assisted therapy and act as pretty useful as a ground for doing psychedelic assisted therapy, since it lives inside these same processes that move, regardless of our ground to use. When psychedelic assisted therapy works, it has change processes that resonate with the ACT perspective, or the broader way I've just voiced it right now.
That's really.
Oh, go ahead,
Sorry,
Niall.
I was just going to say it's really well explained, and it makes a lot of sense. And then I wanted to ask you, Matt, like from the research and the trials and everything that you've carried out, like what have been some of the major changes that you've been able to notice in people and report on almost, like what do they parallel with what Steve's saying here, or are you finding any differences?
Yeah, very much so. So the thing we can speak on with most confidence is in the clinical research or the therapeutic research, and not all of the work others and myself have done are focused on treating a disorder, but that sort of gets a lot of the attention, and it's super important, to help people. So the things we could speak with most confidence on are like, I've done a line of research helping people quit smoking. We've just wrapped up our first randomized trial with that, using psilocybin to help people quit a tobacco addiction. So we've seen that they, have really high rates of quitting tobacco. And the current trial has looked at compared to nicotine patch treatment, which we know works better than placebo. But the backdrop to virtually all of addictions treatment, there's a far more people that aren't helped. Even if you're successful, 6 months after the quit date, you might have in a particular trial 20% compared to 10% in a placebo condition. That, hey, you'd rather have your chances on the 20% than 10%, but the big elephant in the room is, there's 80-90% that aren't helped regardless of what group you're in. So we're getting some really high success rates, substantially higher than traditional treatment. And then in other areas, we're seeing a number of groups, including some work that I've conducted with colleagues, showing improvements in major depressive disorder, 3 randomized studies, including some work I've done with colleagues, seeing some substantial decreases in depression and anxiety in cancer patients who have any number of DSM disorders that are associated with either depressive and or anxiety symptoms. There's nothing in this DSM, the psychiatry Bible, so to speak, yet, perhaps, that says it's labeled existential distress, but this is essentially a phenomenon that we were treating, which was one of the earlier focuses of foci of psychedelic treatment with LSD back in the 60s. Those were explicitly terminal patients in those older trials. But yeah, those are the, cancer-related distress, depression, addiction. I should mention the great work by my colleague Michael Bogenschutz, again picking up from those threads from the 60s, using psilocybin to treat alcohol use disorder. And so he's completed a relatively large 90-some person randomized trial showing some pretty impressive results with decreases in drinking using psilocybin. And so, those are probably and if we want to include MDMA, which is another compound, not a pharmacologically, not a so-called classic psychedelic, but some substantial overlaps, and you'll get differences in opinion about what you should call a psychedelic or not. I think it's fair to call it a psychedelic, not a classic psychedelic, but this is all just nomenclature, whatever you want to consider it. It's very similar in terms of the way that the experiences people have, some overlaps in the pharmacology, and certainly the treatment model of, compared to most psychiatric medications where you take the substance on a regular basis to, reduce symptoms. It's in the same sort of psychedelic therapy category of having 1, 2, or 3 sessions and then hopefully seeing long-term changes from that. So MDMA has shown incredible promise with PTSD treatment, and that's actually the most advanced in terms of the sense of potentially gaining FDA approval. We may be 2 phase 3 trials have been completed. So within the next year, we may, in fact, I would say probably we'll see FDA approval in the United States for using MDMA for treating PTSD. We'll have to see how FDA evaluates those data, which are all published at this point. But, the big picture is that, what's going on. So given this breadth of disorders that are treated, either, I like to say, you got to think something smells fishy here. Either this is snake oil. How does something work for everything? And certainly it's not everything. It's not going to work for everything, but it is an astonishingly large number of supposedly separate disorders. Either it's snake oil, or there's something going on with, you could call it transdiagnostic processes. There's some commonality between these disorders that are being, moved by this psychedelic treatment. And I think you can express that in any number of ways, but it's what Stephen just described about how psychotherapy works, how psychotherapeutic change happens. And I've written some commentaries, and a number of others have put it in different ways, but essentially that psychedelic therapy is psychotherapy. Yes, it's a medication. You're putting a very powerful biological, a medication, a drug by definition, has clearly very powerful acute effects in the nervous system. But the way it works long-term in terms of helping with these disorders, that's all, well, it's mediated biologically, of course, and psychology versus biology. These are just 2 different sides of the same coin. It's not one or the other. But the level of analysis that seems to be most applicable to understanding how this is working is because it's psychotherapeutic process, whether you're considering that or not. And we get into a very interesting discussion with the regulation, because FDA is not charged, and other, like the European, the EMA in Europe, similar FDA-like entities, typically aren't charged with regulating psychotherapy. And some of the companies going forward sponsoring some of the phase 3 research, they don't want to constrain their therapy to say, and I've been in some of these discussions, it's like, oh, if we have ACT or some other, variety of whatever psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy of one type or another, anything, then you've introduced a hurdle for people to be trained in that, and to have, you can only use it under those conditions, perhaps, if it's approved by FDA. And it's just this very weird zone that the FDA is not used to dealing with. And so I always remind people, like, whether you call it psychotherapy or not, or whether it's nominal psychotherapy or not, some of these trials, like, for example, tobacco addiction work that I've done, we use some nominal CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. In other works, like the cancer work and the depression work that I've helped with, there's no nominal psychotherapy, but all of the so-called, common factors of psychotherapy are clearly at play. There's a rapport established, which we think is important for safety between the therapists and the client, the patient. There's this trusting relationship. People have experiences. There's discussions about what's afterwards, how the people are interpreting, like how they may, change, very sort of, non-directive, but, reflective listening and all of these elements that you would hope would, should be there with any form of good therapy. That's all there. And so the way this works is psychotherapeutic process. And, sometimes it's overstated, and these are, there's limitations in any description, but people will say this is like, years of psychotherapy packed into one day. I mean, that's overstated, since there is preparation and it doesn't always work, but there is something to that. There's no perfect way to state it, but it is like psychotherapeutic process when it works well under a magnifying glass, on rocket boosters, whatever your, analogy is. When it works, it's because there's this rapid acceleration of psychotherapeutic change. People are more likely, it's like the gain is turned up on the system, where these sort of aha moments of insight, people operating from a more flexible framework. A lot of times when people say, whether it's addiction or other, how they're dealing with their cancer, like things they told themselves a million times, like, oh yeah, I'm creating so much of my own suffering, I could choose to get out and enjoy life. The disease itself hasn't, it's not impairing me to that degree yet that I can't go out and enjoy it. But, the sun outside or my grandchildren, but I'm choosing to isolate myself and this type of thing. Or with, addiction, like, I know what I truly value, what the bigger priorities are. And, I know this is killing me, or this is something about it, all these things. But it seems when they come out of these sessions, when it really works, they feel these, to speak loosely, because, we're still in process of figuring out how this works, but it's like they feel it in their bones. They say, I've told myself this a million times, but now it's like, I get it. It really seems this is part of the ineffable thing. It's like they have this realization that is just operating somehow, that it's kind of sunk deeper, and by analogy, into the way they're operating. It's sort of like at a more fundamental level psychologically now. And yeah, it's fascinating.
I think it would be important for us, just in the world, to allow some of the messages that are inside what's happening with psychedelic assisted therapy, but also in psychotherapy, to penetrate into our cultural concepts, because we're carrying around the burden of the idea that mental health is organized around disorders. They're latent diseases. If we just look close enough, we'll find the mechanistic etiology, the course, and the mechanisms that produced it, and the response to treatment is the mechanisms that produce it, and then we'll have diseases. Yeah, but there's not a single psychiatric disease in 50 years, not one. And so, even the feds and NIMH are getting tired of it with what they did with RDoC, the research domain criteria, which, was a good idea, but a finger was on the scale. The guy who came up with it, Tom Insel, has now written an apology in this book, Healing, saying that it probably was a mistake, but it was a $20 billion mistake. And we can't afford that many expensive mistakes. The deep message that's inside here, it's not transdiagnostic, really, because the whole idea of diagnostic is so tied to latent diseases that you have to set it aside. What we're talking about is how to empower human lives. And there's what cul-de-sacs, there's problems. It's trans-problematic, yeah. And these are complex problems that sometimes are clustered to a degree, but there's so much individual variation. Major depression, there's thousands of different ways of combining just those limited sets of signs and symptoms, and they are not reflecting an underlying disease state. There is no underlying disease. sooner or later, I mean, 50 years and how many billions, eventually you say, this was a mistake. There's other ways of thinking about it. So let's think about it more as a developmental process that's complex and allow it to inform us so that there's a reason why the same basic underlying mechanisms are being seen when these things happen. Rocket booster status notwithstanding, they were happening at light speed, and that's in a way it's almost better because you can see the processes of change that way. And then, by golly, and we've done the research on this, we've published some of these studies where we've then looked at, okay, what are the mechanisms and targets of positive psychology? Never mind diseases, but we're just going to look at what people are doing to enhance human performance. How about sports? How about running your business? How about stepping up to the challenges of physical disease, etc.? It's the same processes. So if we absorb that, then I think the regulatory mechanisms and the way that we've built our structures over the last 100 years really has to be challenged here. I'll take an example of smoking, which you mentioned. If you're going to apply antidepressants, let's be honest, is what you're doing there to stop smoking. The flyer that physicians get says, you should apply this with behavioral counseling. And it'll give an 800 number to call. And all of the validating studies, all of them used that as part of the studies. We did an early study on smoking with ACT where we, as a test, eliminated even the social contact with the assessors to come in to do the tests as to whether or not you had really quit smoking. We made it as asocial as we could, but we still gave them medications, and the effect sizes were close to zero. It's never been done to just test. Well, in the case of psychedelics, it's been done. It was done in the 60s and 70s. Here's a chemical, take it, period, without preparation. I mean, in my social group, it was treated more sacramentally almost. We'd prepare, we'd think, we'd make sure somebody would be safe. If the narcs showed up, you wouldn't freak out, you would treat it as something that is a journey. And all the indigenous peoples do that. They all have a rationale. They all have preparation. They all have a post-dosing. And there's a conceptual system, you know what to look for. You don't just go party, and then, run out the door with, God knows how many doses in your body, some of which may be chemically laced with other things. I mean, that train wreck can happen in slow motion again. All you need is big pharma to say, it's all the chemicals. Well, dude, if it's all the chemicals, how come you can't even show with these so-called disorders that it's all the chemicals? There's not one specific and sensitive biomarker for any DSM disorder, not one. And this is not me talking. This is the American Psychiatric Association DSM-5 work group. Go read the report on the creation of DSM-5. That's word for word what it says. So the regulatory environment in which, and this is really like wakes me up at night, would allow us, as a result of this new chance to really dive into some of these deeper areas and have that rocker booster effect with proper guidance, to come out with an end result that just says, yeah, big pharma, script it. And then when whatever you put in that physician's desk guide will be ignored. When we looked at how many people got the 800 number, how many people called that, how many people even checked for, oh, by the way, there's known side effects. If you use that antidepressant to quit smoking, you shouldn't also have an eating disorder that can be life-threatening. You shouldn't. And we went into systems of care, and people were on these drugs and still smoking, and they had known counterindications. It's not safe. And I think we need to say, okay, regulators, it's time to include these human change processes in how treatments are delivered. And if you don't know how to do that, we need to figure out how to do that. And then let's do the research on what's the best way to do orientation for a dosing, let's say. What's the best way to walk out? And there will be better and worse ways of doing that. And I'm pretty sure if we do that, we're going to find some of these same processes of change that we know are helpful in psychotherapy are going to be helpful in setting up psychedelic assisted therapy, doing it right, carrying it forward, making sure it has long-lasting effects. And just throwing chemicals at people, period, end of story, is a train wreck waiting to happen again. We did it, and we've been doing it, and it's not. If all of that was so great, how come our mental health problems are worse now than they were 20 years ago, which they are? How come? There's no indication we're doing a better job of mental health over time. And 1 out of 4 women are on antidepressants last year. You can catch fish in the Biscayne Bay and have a measurable amount of painkillers and antidepressants. I mean, how far are we going to take this insanity? You know, so let's not let this chance for a reboot turn into that train wreck again. There's a deep message in how transdiagnostic, I think transproblematic this is, that needs to be taken seriously by our regulators and government agencies and by big pharma. We can have chemicals and medications be part of the solution, but not decontextualized.
It seems like part of the systemic issue is that just, the nature of what FDA does in terms of focusing on disorders, which of course, most of which is outside of psychiatry or mental health. But, what you say makes complete, sense in terms of what we're seeing with psychedelics. These are developed. It's almost like saying, well, why does, good parenting decrease the likelihood of depression and, a poor reaction to trauma? And, doesn't, it's like, well, it's a developmental, it's part of proper human development and functioning. It's not. And so these problems are, in different ways, issues with, kinks, problems where people have had, issues with that process. So it's a really, really great point about even just the wording of transdiagnostic problems, like focuses on the negative rather than the proper human function. Because this continuum, with positive psychology, the original work that I and colleagues did with psychedelics were all in, healthy normals, and it's all the same stuff. The same relationships we found there, that the so-called mystical experience, which is highly correlated with what's called probably the same thing as oceanic boundlessness experience, but this kind of very sort of transcendental, whatever word you want to use, experience, shows a relate on the session day, by self-report, that shows this relatively impressive not perfect by any means, but impressive correlation with whether it's healthy normals, a couple months later is increase in personality, openness to experience, or in patient populations, decreases in anxiety or depression in cancer patients, or better able to deal with their tobacco addiction long-term. So it's completely consistent, what we're seeing. And I should say that, one of this artificial divide between the disorder and the healthy psychedelics, that distinction is one of the many things that really it's helped to hit home with me, because I've been in, as well as being a scientist and all the setting things up and analyzing, I've been in the sessions with dozens of sessions with people, and which is a very very kind of intimate, very, like, you see people crying, everything, all the emotions, and it doesn't matter what they're there for. I've even done work with it hasn't been published yet, long-term meditators. So you might think at some level, these people have done all their they've taken care of their psychological baggage, and they're going to be very high functioning in all the ways. And when someone's on a high dose of psilocybin, you see the same, sort of all the same examples of human functioning, long-term meditator, where the experience is about, my older sibling was always the one that got all the attention, and how that was been an issue for me, and I still think about that. Or you're there to just quit smoking, but then I've seen this a couple of times, some traumatic event from 30 years ago that you didn't really process. I'm not talking about recovered memories or anything like that, but something that someone remembers that was this, horrible event that they've never seen a professional about. They haven't really processed in any way. It just sort of comes to the surface, so to speak. And that's, that just, it's called to be dealt with by the person, which is part of the, as this stuff goes mainstream, going to be the issue. It's like you can't control, like, it's not like, oh no, that's not about quitting smoking. It's like, you're not supposed to have that experience. Like, it does seem clinically like the way you have to do this is just say whatever experience comes up during the session, a mindfulness type, perspective of like, observe it, go with it, don't fight it, surrender. We're going to keep you safe, but you've never had the wrong experience. You haven't messed up by focusing on this or that. Just kind of keep going with it, surrender. Don't try to fight the experience. Very hard to operationalize, but yeah, this distinction between the normal and the abnormal is just, it hits home that we're all human. And we all have issues. We all have this developmental trajectory where we have some, a variety of issues along that path of our life. And yeah, I wonder, with the easier said than done, but we need to rework the FDA from the ground up, or just take mental health out of the FDA and have a psychologically based regulatory system. Because I mean, they're on the medication side, they're medications, and so there's value in the government keeping the snake oil out of the system and making sure people aren't overdosed and all of that. But yeah, how are we going to go forward? It's a challenge.
Yeah, I would like to see us rework the diagnostic system and make it far more ideographic and process oriented. But there's something I wanted to raise here that's in the research with the psychedelics. Kind of turn it to a direction. Is it okay now? One of the core mediators of change, the one you mentioned, these mystical experiences, spiritual experiences, oceanic awareness, different ways of talking about it, seem like they really focus, if you were to look at the things I was talking about earlier about psychological flexibility, cast in a broader way, can capture most of what we know about how psychotherapy makes a difference. There's this core one of sense of self. And I think you can see it developmentally, even in children, where, we're learning, and consciousness is in the sense of being able to respond to the regularities between yourself and the environment is going up. And then there's a kind of a break, and infantile amnesia settles in, and there's a different kind of creature. This young child, somewhere around 3 or 4, is entering into a different way of thinking so thoroughly that even the things they were doing just a year earlier, singing Thomas the Tank Engine, I've seen it with my children, they can no longer sing those songs. It's like they're become different. And it's right on this issue of perspective taking and sense of self, of being able, in a sense, to step outside yourself, to look back at yourself. And it links to these ideas of time, place, and person, of I and you, here and there, now and then, which we call in the underlying cognitive theory to act, relational frame theory, we call them deictic framing. When they come together into the I, here, and nowness of awareness, and you can imagine being anywhere on the planet, you can imagine what you will be like as an old person, or you can put yourself behind the eyes of another and get a sense of what it's like to be in the Ukraine or be in Israel right now, or that's a different kind of consciousness. And I think often we allow this sense of self to be dominated by these more, I'm like this and I'm good because of that, is more categorical cognitive things, without digging down in the experience of awareness that is the sort of strand on which the beads of experience will be placed, and allows you to have a kind of a sense of, yeah, I'm the same person as I was when I was 6, even though all your cells in your body are different, right? And so forth. And that seems to happen at light speed with psychedelics, that people have a sense of expansion across time, place, and person, as if this has broken down in that oceanic awareness or mystical experience. If you unpack mystical spiritual experiences, they all seem to have that same shift of not just me, but me, you, in a kind of an organized system. We're not just here, but here, there, not just now, but now and then, expanding across time, place, and person. And, language like that is not evolutionarily recent. I mean, maybe the hominids were doing it. Maybe it's 2 billion years old, 3 million years old, could be 500,000 years old. And it's harnessing midbrain structures that are 1,000 times older. I mean, operant and classical conditioning is 500 million years old. All the creatures that evolved from the Cambrian forward, 500 million years ago, do operant and classical conditioning. So learning the kind of consciousness that means just learning how to navigate our interaction with the environment changed. And it changed, I think, in this thing that we're doing right now, human language and cognition. And we see it. And the reason that seems important to me is that if we know that that's the breaking point, if we take seriously these mediational studies of psychedelic assisted therapy, well, then it means that we really ought to be focusing more attention on how to expand people's sense of self, even outside of psychedelic assisted therapy, to be able to do things that we can see in psychedelic assisted therapy, like rapid progression when I just kind of open the gates and I'm able to be more present. And I'm reminded just of some of the fMRI studies where it looks like this narrative sense of self is eliminating our access to sensory and sensory motor information. We literally don't know the world we're living in because we're living inside a story. And we're telling that how great we are, how awful we are, how we were mistreated, how, our brother got better treatment than we did, like the example you're using. And then you remove those gatekeepers chemically, and with the right orientation, you see yourself and your relation to the world in a different way. And that's profound, I think, and important and telling about the human experience. There's something really deep to be learned from psychedelics, in my opinion, theoretically, that applies to this moment right now, just between the three of us or others who will watch this. It applies to us all the time. And it's buried in our usual sense of consciousness that doesn't allow us to see the centrality of sense of self to how we relate to ourselves in the world.
Yeah, I this is all fascinating, and I think about how perhaps what the psychedelics are able to do is something that the human animal has been doing for a long time, and there's certainly some evidence for this, whether it be through some crazy acoustical techniques or going deep into caves, or chanting, and just all these various rituals to achieve what you call altered states of consciousness. We don't know how far back that goes back, but it may be that this sort of boundary dissolving, these types of techniques evolved with the human animal as a way to offset the very necessary tool of that sense of self. But maybe that we only went forward because, kind of like clothing, like it was advantageous to lose the hair to be more adaptive, because then we could put on or off the elk fur or whatever to keep ourselves warm. Just like, well, we somehow perhaps gained this sort of sense of self, which allowed us to do all of these wonderful things. But at the same time, we also needed perhaps these other rituals to, okay, how do when the neighboring tribe is attacking, how do you get some of the men in the village to jump to the front and like give up their lives in defense of, who's going to climb to the top of the electric pole to restore power and put their life at risk for the community, who or sacrifice themselves for the children in one way, shape, or form. These, I could imagine from a game theory perspective. I'm certainly not the first to say this, but at the social level, at the group level, there's a selection factor. And perhaps these experiences were part of that, and perhaps very speculative here, but the serotonin 2A receptor that mediates most of these psychedelic effects. It's the primary site of action. We don't know yet, but perhaps a lot of these other methods are activating that. We know that that receptor system is more pronounced in humans than they are other primates, more in primates than other mammals, etc. So perhaps psychedelics are one particular key to kind of like tap into something that has been important for human evolution, that involves this at least temporary, going beyond the self to keep yourself and society, the culture, the tribe sane and functioning.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really cool thought, and the things that are most characteristic of human beings are cognition, culture, and cooperation. We're the most cooperative of the primates, and I think cooperation is likely what came first. It just makes more evolutionary sense for that to be. And even maybe our simplest terms, or having a name for, this is a cup, and then the bidirectionality that happens somewhere in stimulus equivalence, the term that's used in behavioral psychology, around between 12 and 16 months, probably started in cooperation, because if the troop, just having characteristic sounds, for example, for objects, that's common across many animals, non-human animals, and being able to respond to sounds or signs or whatever, and in characteristic ways, is also common, but as an integrated system where if you learn it in one direction, you derive it in two. It looks like we're the only ones that really do that robustly. I mean, backward conditioning is there, but barely. And with 12 to 16 months, you can, with a few examples, you don't just get it without any exposure to language. You have a new object, give it a name, take it away, say the name. The baby looks for the object, and even language-trained chimps don't do that. That's been tested multiple times, and zero. They just don't do it. And don't write me about your dog and cat. I know your dog and cat is smart, but no, they don't do it. But the effect of that means that maybe even within the troop, that we were able to say, like, call out for an apple and have a member of the troop bring back an apple from across a ravine, because that two-way street of cooperation means that I can maybe kind of get, and we can see this in infants even before they develop language, that there's a theory of mind, that there's an intention, that I want something. And out of that, then troops form that would eventually you can internalize that within yourself, and you can be both speaker and listener, and now you have a symbolic system. But with that, it's going to stick on you. With that, you're going to say, hey, I'm the better one, I'm the smarter one, I'm the whatever. Learning how to have that change in sense of self, that is now a narrative sense of self, not interfere with the cooperative basis of human communication, period, end of story, is probably something I would think that you'd want rituals and exercises when, never mind psychedelics. I mean, it could be, as you say, just fasting or chanting or breathing, or to break it down enough that the I, you, we, they, the kind of relationships that are needed for cooperation are sustained. Because our success as a human species has been dependent on that. I mean, you put an individual human being out alone, and they're not going to survive very long until they've had a lot of socialization. I mean, we take one of the longest periods of time where we're dependent on these giants around us called adults as babies, just to feed us, care us, and we're frankly not, we're cute. And you dump natural endorphins in your brain when you see the cute eyes of babies, but they poop on the floor, they puke on you. I mean, who the hell would take care of these creatures? So we've figured out a way, I think, as human beings, to make this cooperative system work. And then we've created a modern culture where it can really not work, where loneliness, disconnection, isolation is this characteristic. And even in big cities, people are walking around feeling as though they're the only person on the planet. They're so alone. And, what happens in the psychedelic stuff is it feels like somehow you're connected again. You're part of something bigger. You're part of a human community. And time, place, and person shifts. And it's massively empowering to people. So, sense of self, it's something we really need to figure out how to unpack. And I think there's a peek into the future from the psychedelic work that maybe we can expand on.
That's beautifully said, Stephen. And now it sort of leads me into, I wanted to end asking you guys about your thoughts on the future of psychedelic therapy. And the question that kind of jumped to mind whenever I was thinking about this was, if you two could design a center that was to go into every town or city in the world, right? And the aim was to alleviate as much suffering in that town as possible and promote as much flourishing as possible. What would that center look like? Like, what would kind of like the elements that you would include in that sort of thing? And think about like a post office or a Starbucks, or whatever. It's going to be in every town in the world or every city. So who wants to go first here?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I sometimes think of psychedelic therapy, and we've touched upon this theme in different ways throughout this conversation, but it's sort of a Trojan horse. It's kind of the most interesting thing is not about the psychedelic therapy. It's just showing us things. Like I've said, it's kind of a way to bring psychology back into psychiatry, which psychology used to be the basis of psychiatry, but it's certainly not now. Or just in terms of human functioning, or positive psychology, and I think it's pointing towards the importance of what you could call it, like healthy human development, and a healthy mental life. And so one of the things that I the directions I hope that it helps lead us to is the idea that we need, preventative healthcare really isn't the right way to say it, given our discussion of it's really about human flourishing. But something like, I'm astonished by the idea that you're supposed to get a yearly physical, and how often you only treat the so-called mental stuff when there's a problem, right? And we're living in this increasingly complex, insane world with, you name it, the media, social media, isolation. You have all of these issues with this issue for one person to have catastrophic effects on others, like the whole mass shooting phenomenon in schools. The whole idea that we don't already have preventative mental health care, not once a year, but I'm thinking like once a month, like just to be a human being in modern society. Is like, it seems to be, it would be worthwhile, like for it just to be considered almost frowned upon. It's like if you say you haven't been to the dentist in 30 years, it's like if you haven't had some type of a relationship with a mental health professional within the last year, you're like, oh, you really need to get on that, even if you're healthy. I hope that this kind of the focus on the psychedelic therapy helps to bring this about, more of this idea that the law of entropy plays out across all aspects of the universe, including human our physical body, our mental health. Like, we're going to go towards decay and disorder unless energy is put in to keep us integrated, and fighting entropy. So those clinics, I would think, wouldn't even be, maybe every once in a blue moon they'd involve a psychedelic, but it'd be where people would show up and they'd have a relationship, and it would just be the daily check-in. It's sort of like the idea of school counselors, which I wish they were utilized more like this. It's like, not just when there's problems, like every student should have a relationship with their school counselor, and that way you're catching people long before they're having problems. But that should extend into all of life. I mean, I wouldn't want to force people into this, but I wish culture moved in a way that that was sort of the norm. And we kind of viewed it more as like, yeah, you need to be exercising, you need to be getting a physical, you need to be keeping yourself up because you're going to go to disorder unless you put some energy into the system.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing that, Matt. Steve, what about yourself?
It's a really, really cool question. And I think if we could break out of the latent mental disease set into a mental resilience set, how do we create modern minds for this modern world where we're going to be exposed to judgment and pain and comparison, these toxic processes that are hard for us all. With the computers we carry in our pockets, our 6-year-olds are exposed to it. They see more death and dying and distress, than your grandfather did, and even unless he was in a war, and even then more. And so I think the way that we need to do it when we push this reset button is get back to the individual and begin to look at longitudinally what are the processes of change that they're building. Because you can't do it in a top-down normative categorical concept. There is no one-size-fits-all. The deep message of the failure of the latent disease model is we need to go back to a more idiographic focus and then build up into subgroups if and only if they increase the precision of our understanding of the individual. And processes of change can do that. That's, by the way, in the deep background of behavior analysis and behavioral thinking. These principles were built on focusing on the individual organism in small n studies. If we go back to that and we start looking, okay, let's measure these processes of change. There's not so many. We can simplify it. I gave an earlier description, learning how to be more open, aware, and actively engaged, take care of your body, extend that to social groups. I can say it in a sentence. It's not that hard. I can ask questions, or we can use wearables and so forth that look over time, how well are you doing with that? And treat you as a kind of complex evolving system, which is what you are. You're not in a normative category. And you can't even go from the stats that are normative to this because it violates a thing called the ergodic theorem. We haven't talked about it, but the statistics that tell people that you can go from bell curves to knowing the future of individuals are false. They're based on a mathematical error. So let's look at how change is happening in your life and then have kernels, techniques, methods that can target it. So that, let's say, example, I'm emotionally avoiding things. When painful emotions come up, I run away. You can get away with that for a little while, but you're not going to get away with it for very long. And boy, if you had to pick one toxic process of all of them out there, it's one of the worst. It correlates with almost everything bad. Okay, how would I learn to be more emotionally open? It's going to be one step at a time. It needs to be sensitive to context. But I could see already in your life, if I'm measuring it, that you're headed in a direction where you're going to need that skill. And it's one of a small set of skills. I'm president of a thing called the Institute for Better Health. It's a charitable organization, so I can say this without a conflict of interest at all. I've developed an app called MindGrapher that does that. We collect high density longitudinal data and then we analyze it one person at a time and tells you kind of what are the processes. It's not yet commercially available. And then it needs to be linked, I think, to apps and methods or your imagined clinic that would then focus in and target with kernels, not a whole big 20-session long psychotherapy thing, but kernels done repeatedly over time, like the dentist model. Here's how to clean between your teeth. Here's how to learn to become a little more emotionally open. Why? Because mental resilience in a modern mind in the modern world is going to be what you need. And I've also developed an app for that as part of a larger group. It's commercial. I'll do a pause so you can eliminate this now if it's not right. But it's actually available, called PsychFlex. And MindGrapher plugs into it as well as being independently available. So I'm trying to answer your question through technology and empowering clinicians, which is what the app is for, to be able to give nudges and bumps based on what the processes of change show within the person's life over time. And that is a very different vision than these latent disease visions that you have something. It's more like you're doing things, and there are many things, and they fit together in a system. We can do a lot better than what we've been doing of this one-size-fits-all vision. Instead, view it as an empowerment vision. And I think we better, because all of the indicators of mental and behavioral health are going in the wrong direction. And in very basic things like the several 100% increase in suicidality in preteen adolescents over the last 3 or 4 years, the need is so great that we either step up to it or we're going to suffer the consequences. And I think there's a hopeful vision in here and in this conversation. And if psychedelics can help advance that, boy, that would be awesome.
Awesome, right? Well, that's a great note to end on. And Steve, we'll definitely not cut the information about Psychedelics. We'll link to that in the show notes for that too. That's an incredible resource you've developed. Where can people find you two online after this conversation? Matt?
So probably the best place for me long-term would be Twitter, or I guess now X. That's where I'm probably post the most at drug_researcher.
Great. And Steve?
Best way to find me and connect into what I do is just stevenchayes.com. Click on yes, please send it to me. You get on my mailing list. I don't spam people. It's a one-click opt-out if I ever do. And I send out newsletters and stuff every 3 or 4 weeks.
Brilliant. Right. Well, it's been absolutely fascinating to explore this with you guys, and I want to wish you the best of luck going forward.
Thank you for the opportunity. Been awesome.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Matt, for the conversation.
Likewise.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. If you'd like to hear the full version, you can do so with the Weekend University Premium membership. This gets you access to our mastered library of over 5 years of psychology conferences, including over 230 talks and interviews with the world's leading psychologists, professors, and authors, unlimited CPD certification, transcripts, quizzes, premium passes for our annual conference, online courses with Richard Schwartz and Deb Dana, and more. The cost is £97 for 1 year, which breaks down at around 27p per day. The best bit is you can try it out for 30 days completely risk-free, as all orders come with a 100% money-back guarantee. If you're interested, please go to twmembers.com for more information.